The October sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Henry Mitchell's penthouse on the Upper East Side. He stood at the window, his reflection ghosting against the glass, showing a man in his 50s wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His hand gripped a crystal tumbler of scotch while his other palm pressed against the cool glass, 60 stories above Manhattan. The apartment hummed with technology. Smart displays showed stock tickers, news feeds, and calendar reminders. A robotic vacuum weaved between Italian leather furniture. Everything was automated, optimized, and cold. Henry's watch buzzed, another meeting notification. He ignored it, focusing instead on the empty spaces in his home. No family photos adorned the walls. No evidence of a life beyond work and wealth. His phone rang. Another startup wanting funding. He declined the call without looking at it. These days, every entrepreneur thought they had the next big thing. Henry had heard thousands of pitches, invested in hundreds of companies, but something was missing. Success had become routine, almost boring. Across the city in Brooklyn, Tiffany Robinson stood at a podium in a community center. The room was packed with young entrepreneurs, mostly Black and Hispanic, all eager to hear from someone who understood their struggles. Her voice carried authority earned through years of experience. "When I started, nobody would give me a chance," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Banks saw my zip code and shut their doors. Investors saw my skin color and made excuses. But that didn't stop me, and it shouldn't stop you." She adjusted her blazer, professional but accessible, like the bridge she'd become between communities. The audience nodded, took notes. Some recorded her speech on their phones. Tiffany had built her reputation by being direct, honest, and relentless in supporting minority entrepreneurs. She'd turned her own pain into purpose, though the weight of old wounds still showed in the tight set of her shoulders. "We're not asking for handouts," she continued. "We're asking for equal access to opportunity. And if they won't give it to us, we'll create our own." Her voice didn't waver, but her hand briefly touched the necklace she wore, a habit from harder times. In a converted warehouse space in Bushwick, Jordan sat with his team around a table cluttered with laptops and empty coffee cups. At 28, he carried himself with the intensity of someone with something to prove. His startup's logo, Sustainable Future Tech, decorated one wall, while whiteboards covered in diagrams and code filled another. "The green energy market is growing exponentially," Jordan explained, pointing to projected figures. "Our solar storage solution could revolutionize how communities access clean power." His team, 4 young engineers and a marketing specialist, watched intently. They believed in him, but belief alone wouldn't secure their next round of funding. Sarah, his lead engineer, raised a concern. "The prototype works, but scaling up manufacturing costs dash." "We'll figure it out," Jordan cut in, perhaps too quickly. He caught himself, took a breath. "Sorry. You're right. We need to address the cost issue before the competition." His fingers drummed against the table, a nervous habit he'd developed during countless nights working late. The afternoon light slanted through dusty windows, highlighting the contrast between their modest office and their ambitious goals. Jordan's phone buzzed, a message from his mother. He'd tell her about the competition later. Right now, he needed to focus on the pitch that could make or break everything they'd worked for. Each of them carried their own weight, Henry in his tower of success and solitude, Tiffany in her mission to change the system, and Jordan in his drive to prove himself in a world that wasn't built for him. None of them knew how soon their paths would cross, or how their carefully constructed worlds would collide. Henry's executive assistant placed the invitation on his desk without ceremony. "The Tech Futures Competition. They're requesting you as a lead judge and potential investor." She waited as he scanned the glossy brochure, its pages filled with promises of innovation and disruption. Another startup competition. Henry leaned back in his ergonomic chair, surrounded by screens displaying market data. "What makes this one different? It's focused on sustainable technology. Green energy, environmental solutions." She pulled up details on his main display. "They're specifically targeting diverse founders and breakthrough innovations. The press coverage could be significant." Henry's fingers traced the edge of the invitation. His last few investments had been safe, predictable. The market was whispering about him losing his edge, becoming too conservative. He thought about the empty halls of his penthouse, the monotony of his success. Set up the preliminary meetings, he decided. I want detailed backgrounds on all the finalists before I step foot in that room. The assistant nodded and left, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. Henry turned to the window, wondering if he'd find something worth his time in this batch of dreamers. In a modest Brooklyn apartment, Tiffany stared at her laptop screen, reading Jordan's competition application for the 10th time. Her coffee had gone cold, forgotten as she analyzed every word. The Tech Futures competition was prestigious, with a history of launching successful companies. It was also known for its old money investors and traditional biases. Her phone lit up with Jordan's face. "Mom, did you get the email I sent?" "I'm looking at it now," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Baby, are you sure about this? These competitions." She trailed off, remembering her own battles in the tech world. "I know the odds," Jordan replied. "But our technology works. We've got the data to prove it." His voice carried the same determination she'd heard in his voice since he was a child, declaring he'd build robots in their tiny living room. "They might not see past their own prejudices," Tiffany warned. "I've watched brilliant ideas get shot down because the person presenting them didn't fit someone's image of success." "Then they'll be making a mistake," Jordan said firmly. "We're not just another startup, Mom. What we're building could change how entire communities access clean energy." Tiffany closed her eyes, pride and fear warring in her chest. "Just be prepared. These investors, they can be brutal." In his office, Jordan hung up the phone and turned to the task ahead. His team had stayed late again, fueled by determination and vending machine snacks. The prototype sat on a workbench, its sleek design masking months of trial and error. "Okay, let's run through it again," he announced, standing before the whiteboard. "We have 3 weeks to perfect this presentation." He wrote out their timeline, his handwriting sharp and focused. Sarah looked up from her laptop. "The energy efficiency numbers are solid. We're outperforming traditional systems by 40%. "Good, but they'll want more than numbers." Jordan paced the room, his shadow moving across diagrams and charts. "They'll want to know about market penetration, scaling potential." He stopped, staring at their financial projections. "And they'll want to know why they should trust us with their money." The question he didn't voice hung in the air: why should they trust a young black founder with no connections, no Ivy League degree, no family money backing him? Jordan had fought for every opportunity, worked jobs through college, built his prototype in borrowed space. He thought about his mother's warning, about all the doors that had closed in their faces over the years. But he also thought about the communities that could benefit from his technology, about proving that innovation didn't just come from privileged backgrounds. His hand brushed against the last family photo taken before his father left, before Henry walked away from his pregnant wife and unborn child. Jordan kept it as a reminder, though his team thought it was just a random photo of his mom. The competition wasn't just about the technology anymore. It was about showing that he could succeed in spite of, or perhaps because of, everything he and his mother had endured. The office grew quiet as night fell over Brooklyn. Jordan's team gradually packed up, leaving him alone with the prototype and his thoughts. He pulled up the competition guidelines one more time, studying the list of judges and investors. Names and faces of people who'd never known struggle, who'd never had to fight for respect. "We're ready," he whispered to himself, a promise and a challenge. The prototype hummed softly in response, its green indicator light steady in the darkness. The competition venue buzzed with nervous energy. The auditorium at the New York Tech Center gleamed with polished wood and chrome, filled with entrepreneurs clutching presentation materials and investors studying their portfolios. Henry sat in the front row, center position, his tablet displaying detailed profiles of each contestant. He'd already dismissed 3 presentations mentally, too derivative, too risky, too simple. Mr. Mitchell, a competition organizer, approached, clipboard in hand. "We have 8 more presentations today. Number 6 might interest you particularly. They're working on revolutionary solar storage technology." Henry nodded without looking up. "Let's hope they have more than just promises." His finger swiped through the preliminary data on sustainable future tech. The numbers were impressive, but he'd seen impressive numbers before. The market was littered with failed startups that had good ideas but couldn't execute. The lights dimmed as another presenter took the stage. Henry settled into his role, his expression neutral but scrutinizing. Each gesture, each financial projection, each stumbled word, he catalogued them all. The other judges occasionally leaned towards him, seeking his reactions. 20 years of successful investments had earned him that influence. Behind the stage, Jordan stood in the wings, watching the current presentation wind down. His team huddled nearby, making last-minute adjustments to their slides. Sarah handed him a water bottle, which he accepted but didn't drink. "Remember," she whispered, "we tested the prototype hundreds of times. The numbers are solid." Jordan straightened his tie, dark blue, professional, chosen carefully for this moment. Through the curtain, he could see the judges' row. Henry Mitchell's presence was impossible to miss, his reputation casting a shadow longer than his actual influence. Jordan had studied every article, every interview, every investment Henry had made in the past 5 years. The current presenter faced a barrage of questions from the judges. Their answers grew more uncertain with each challenge. Jordan watched their body language, their defensive posture. He wouldn't make the same mistakes. He couldn't afford to. In the middle of the audience, Tiffany sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She'd chosen a seat where she could see both Jordan and Henry clearly. The latter hadn't changed much in 28 years, still commanding, still intimidating, still carrying himself like he owned every room he entered. She watched him questioning the current presenter, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. He was detailed, incisive, showing no mercy for unprepared entrepreneurs. This was what Jordan would face in less than 30 minutes. Her throat tightened. Next presenter, the moderator announced, Sustainable Future Tech, presenting their innovative solar energy storage solution. Jordan stepped onto the stage, his footsteps silent on the polished wood. The spotlight found him as he moved to center stage. The screen behind him lit up with his company's logo, clean, professional, forward-thinking. Henry's attention sharpened. Something about the young man's presence caught his eye. There was a confidence there, not the brash overconfidence of privileged youth, but something earned. He sat forward slightly, tablet forgotten for a moment. "Good morning," Jordan began, his voice steady. "We're here today to discuss not just technology, but access. Not just innovation, but impact." His eyes swept the audience, deliberately not lingering on Henry. Every word was measured, every gesture practiced. Tiffany's hands tightened further. She saw Henry's interest, saw him studying Jordan with growing attention. She recognized that look, it was the same one he'd worn when he first met her, when he saw something worth investing in. Before everything fell apart. The presentation flowed smoothly. Jordan's team had prepared for every detail. The prototype demonstrations were flawless, the market analysis thorough. But it was Jordan himself who commanded attention. He spoke about community impact with an authority that came from lived experience, about technical specifications with deep understanding. Henry's questions began, each one designed to find weaknesses, to expose flaws in logic or preparation. Jordan met each one head-on, his responses quick but thoughtful. The exchange felt like a chess match, neither man giving ground. Tiffany watched the interplay with growing tension. She saw the moment Henry's professional interest turned to something more personal, saw him struggling to understand why this young presenter seemed familiar somehow. Jordan's features, in the bright stage lights, echoed his father's at the same age. The air in the auditorium grew heavy with unspoken recognition. Other judges sensed something in the exchange between Henry and Jordan, though they couldn't name it. The usual power dynamic of investor and entrepreneur had shifted into something more complex, more charged. As Jordan concluded his presentation, the applause was genuine, strong. He had earned their respect, but more importantly, he had earned their attention. Henry sat back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes followed Jordan as he left the stage. None of them knew it yet, but everything was about to change. The reception area after the presentations hummed with networking conversations and clinking glasses. Henry moved through the crowd with purpose, nodding at familiar faces but focused on reaching Jordan. Something about the young entrepreneur's presentation had stirred something in him, a recognition he couldn't quite place. Jordan stood with his team near their prototype display, fielding questions from other investors. His presentation had created buzz, and a small crowd had gathered. He maintained his professional demeanor, but his eyes kept drifting to Henry's approaching figure. "Mr. Thompson," Henry said, extending his hand. The name felt strange in his mouth, though he didn't know why. Impressive presentation. Though I have some concerns about your scaling projections. Jordan's hand met Henry's in a firm handshake. Time seemed to slow for a moment. Here was the man who had shaped so much of his life through absence, standing before him, unaware. Jordan felt the weight of every father-son conversation they'd never had, every milestone missed. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. I'd be interested in hearing your specific concerns. Jordan's voice remained steady, professional. He'd practiced this moment countless times, though the reality hit harder than any rehearsal. From across the room, Tiffany watched the interaction, her champagne glass untouched. She saw how Jordan's jawline tightened, the same way it did when he was holding back emotion. She saw Henry's subtle frown, the way he studied Jordan's face as if trying to solve a puzzle. Your community implementation model, Henry began, gesturing to the prototype. It's ambitious. Maybe too ambitious. The infrastructure costs alone. He paused, studying the technical specifications displayed on the screen behind Jordan. We've run extensive cost analysis, Jordan responded, pulling up detailed projections on his tablet. The initial investment is higher, yes, but the long-term savings and social impact offset the costs within 3 years. His finger traced the graph lines, showing intersection points and profit margins. Henry leaned in closer, his expression critical. Social impact doesn't pay investors, Mr. Thompson. The market cares about returns, not good intentions. With all due respect, Jordan's voice took on an edge he couldn't quite suppress. The market is changing. Communities that have been traditionally underserved represent an untapped potential. We're not just selling technology, we're opening new markets. The conversation drew attention from nearby investors. They sensed the tension, the clash of perspectives. Henry Mitchell challenging a presenter wasn't unusual, but this felt different. More personal somehow. Sarah stepped forward, ready to support her CEO with technical details, but Jordan subtly waved her back. This was his battle. He needed to face Henry on his own terms. Your technical solution is solid, Henry admitted, still studying the prototype. But you're letting personal conviction cloud your business judgment. Sentiment doesn't scale. Jordan felt a familiar anger rise, the same anger that had driven him through countless nights of work, through every closed door and dismissive investor. My conviction comes from understanding markets you've ignored, Mr. Mitchell. Communities you've written off as unprofitable. The words carried a weight Jordan hadn't intended to reveal. Henry looked up sharply, catching something in the young man's tone. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the crowded reception area seemed to fade away. Tiffany moved closer, unable to stay back any longer. She saw the recognition starting to form in Henry's eyes, saw him taking in Jordan's features with growing uncertainty. She knew that look, had seen it decades ago when Henry first started to pull away, when commitment and responsibility began to feel too heavy. We should discuss this further, Henry said finally, breaking the tension. My office, next week. Your technology has potential, but it needs refinement. He pulled out a business card, holding it out like a peace offering. Jordan took the card, his fingers barely touching Henry's. I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Mitchell. But I should be clear, I won't compromise on the community impact aspect. It's not just a selling point. It's the foundation of everything we're building. Henry nodded slowly, that nagging sense of familiarity growing stronger. We'll see. Sometimes the market forces us to adapt our vision. Or maybe, Jordan replied, his voice carrying years of unspoken challenge, it's the market that needs to adapt. They parted ways, each carrying the weight of an interaction that meant more than either could openly acknowledge. Henry moved through the crowd, glancing back occasionally at Jordan, trying to place the echo of something familiar in the young man's determined stance. Jordan watched him go, the business card heavy in his pocket. He'd imagined their first real conversation countless times over the years, but never like this. Not as competitors, not as investor and entrepreneur. The irony wasn't lost on him, seeking validation from the men who'd never been there to validate him before. Tiffany finally approached her son, touching his arm gently. You okay, baby? Jordan nodded, his professional mask slipping slightly under his mother's concerned gaze. I'm fine. Just business. But they both knew it was more than that. Much more. Tiffany stood in the women's restroom of the tech center, gripping the marble countertop, staring at her reflection. The sophisticated woman looking back at her was a far cry from the scared, pregnant 22-year-old Henry had abandoned. She'd spent years building herself up, creating a life without him, protecting Jordan. Now, in one afternoon, all those carefully constructed walls were threatening to crumble. Through the door, she could still hear the buzz of the reception. Henry's voice occasionally carried above the crowd, confident, authoritative, unchanged. Her hand shook as she reapplied her lipstick. She should confront him. Tell him exactly who Jordan was. Make him face what he'd walked away from. But she hesitated. Jordan's future hung in the balance. One wrong move could jeopardize everything he'd worked for. Henry had power in this industry, power to make or break startups with a single word. Get it together, she whispered to herself. This isn't about you anymore. She straightened her blazer, checked her hair. The woman in the mirror nodded back, ready for battle. In the conference room they'd claimed as their temporary headquarters, Jordan sat with his team, Henry's business card placed in the center of the table like a loaded weapon. Sarah was pulling up market research on her laptop while the others reviewed Henry's public investment history. His criticism about scaling costs isn't entirely wrong, Sarah admitted, turning her screen to show a spreadsheet. But our community-based implementation model could actually reduce overall infrastructure expenses. Jordan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He remembered being 8 years old, Googling Henry's name for the first time. Finding articles about his success, his wealth, his influence. Now here was his father, offering the very validation he'd once desperately craved, but as an investor, not a parent. We need to rework the presentation, he decided, standing to pace the room. Not to remove the community focus, but to strengthen the business case. Show him, show everyone, that social impact and profit aren't mutually exclusive. His team watched him with concern. They'd never seen him this intense, this driven. Usually, Jordan was the calm one, the voice of reason. Now there was something else in his voice, something personal. Boss, Sarah said quietly, are you sure you're okay? That interaction with Mitchell seemed tense. Jordan forced a smile. Just business. He's a tough investor to impress. The lie felt heavy on his tongue, but he couldn't tell them the truth. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Meanwhile, Tiffany had found her way to a quiet corner of the building's atrium. She sat on a sleek modern bench, surrounded by potted plants that tried too hard to bring nature indoors. Her mind wandered back to 28 years ago, to the small apartment she and Henry had shared before his first big break. They'd been so young, so in love. Henry had been different then, hungry for success but still grounded, still capable of seeing beyond dollar signs and market shares. She remembered the night she told him about the pregnancy. He'd smiled, hugged her. But something had changed after that. As his first company took off, as the investors started calling, he'd grown distant. The pregnancy had become an inconvenience, a complication in his rising trajectory. The day he left, he'd written her a check, as if their relationship, their future child, could be reduced to a simple transaction. She'd torn it up in front of him. We don't need your money, she'd said. But this baby will need a father. He'd walked out anyway. Now, watching Jordan navigate the same world that had taken Henry from them, she felt a complex mix of pride and terror. Her son had grown into everything Henry should have been, brilliant, ambitious, but with a heart, with principles. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jordan, meeting with Mitchell scheduled for next Tuesday. 2 p.m. Tiffany closed her eyes. 1 week. 1 week to decide whether to let this play out or to protect her son from another potential disappointment. She thought about all the times Jordan had asked about his father as a child. How she'd tried to be honest without destroying his sense of self-worth. Your father made his choice, she'd always said. But that choice says everything about him and nothing about you. The atrium's glass ceiling led in the late afternoon sun, casting shadows that reminded her of other days, other choices. She'd built a life from the ashes of Henry's abandonment. Built a community of support for others like her. Found strength she never knew she had. But seeing Henry today, watching him interact with the son he didn't recognize, it had reopened wounds she thought had long since healed. The way he'd looked at Jordan with professional interest rather than paternal pride. The way he'd critiqued and challenged without knowing he was addressing his own flesh and blood. Ms. Robinson. A young assistant appeared. The closing reception is starting. Tiffany stood, smoothing her skirt. She had a week to decide. A week to either protect the careful life she'd built or let truth shatter 2 decades of silence. In her heart, she knew the choice wasn't really hers anymore. It belonged to Jordan now. Henry sat in his corner office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that seemed to hold Manhattan in a glass cage. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, but his attention was fixed on his computer screen. He'd spent the last 3 hours reviewing Sustainable Future Tech's business plan, financial projections, and technical specifications. Something about this company, about Jordan Thompson, wouldn't let him go. He'd canceled 2 meetings to dive deeper into the research. The technology was solid, innovative even. The community implementation model, while unconventional, showed promise. But it was more than that. There was something familiar in the way Jordan thought, in how he approached problems. "Send in the background check results," he spoke into his intercom. His assistant appeared moments later with a thin file. "There isn't much, sir," she said, placing it on his desk. Jordan Thompson, graduated summa cum laude from City College. Full scholarship. Worked multiple jobs through school. Started his first small tech company at 23. No criminal record, no bankruptcies, no red flags. Henry frowned, flipping through the pages. The story was too clean, too simple. What about family? Single mother. Tiffany Thompson. No father listed on the birth certificate. She paused. Should I dig deeper? No, Henry said quickly, too quickly. That's all. He waited until she left before opening the file again, staring at the name. Tiffany Thompson. Something nagged at the back of his mind, but he pushed it away. Across town, in a cramped conference room that smelled of coffee and determination, Jordan stood before his team. The whiteboard behind him was covered in numbers, strategies, rebuttals to every possible objection Henry might raise. If Mitchell offers to invest, Jordan announced, his voice firm, we decline. Sarah nearly dropped her tablet. What? Jordan, his investment could solve our scaling issues overnight. His name alone would attract other investors. It's not just about the money. Jordan turned to the window, watching the same sunset from a different angle. I won't let him control our vision. The minute we take his money, he'll push us to abandon the community focus. You don't know that, Sarah argued. His last few investments have shown some social consciousness. That green energy project in California dash. I know him better than you think, Jordan cut her off. His hand clenched around the marker he was holding. Trust me on this. We find other investors. Ones who believe in what we're really trying to build. The team exchanged glances. They'd never seen this side of Jordan, this personal, almost visceral resistance to what seemed like an obvious opportunity. In a small cafe 2 blocks from Henry's office, Tiffany sat waiting. She'd called his office using her old connections in the industry, demanded a meeting. Now, watching him approach through the window, she felt 28 years of carefully contained emotions threatening to spill over. Henry spotted her immediately. He stopped just inside the door, his expression flickering between recognition and disbelief. She wasn't the young woman he'd left behind anymore, but there was no mistaking who she was. Tiffany, he said, sliding into the seat across from her. I didn't. I mean, when they said Thompson wanted to meet. Surprised. Her voice was steady, controlled. Or just disappointed you can't avoid me this time. Henry's fingers drummed on the table, a nervous habit she remembered from their past. Why now, Tiffany? After all these years. You know why. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. Jordan. My son. Your son. The color drained from Henry's face. The nagging familiarity, the inexplicable connection he'd felt, it all suddenly made terrible sense. Jordan is. The young man whose dreams you're planning to either fund or destroy. Yes. The baby you walked away from. Yes. Tiffany's voice remained low, but each word carried the weight of decades of pain. He doesn't know you're his father. Not yet. But he will. Henry sat back, his world tilting on its axis. Why didn't you tell me? All these years. Tell you. Tiffany's laugh was bitter. You left us. Wrote a check like we were some investment gone bad. You didn't want to know. She pulled out an old photograph, Jordan at his college graduation. But now you need to know. Because I won't let you hurt him again. Not as a father, and not as an investor. Henry stared at the photo, seeing his own features mixed with Tiffany's in their son's face. The resemblance that had nagged at him now seemed obvious, undeniable. The competition, his company, is legitimate. Every bit of it. He did it all without you, without your money or your connections. Pride and accusation mingled in her voice. So before you decide whether to invest in his company, you need to understand exactly what you're dealing with. Who you're dealing with. The cafe bustled around them, oblivious to the drama unfolding at their small table. Henry's hand shook slightly as he reached for his water glass. Does he hate me? He built himself into something amazing despite you, Tiffany answered. That's all you need to know for now. Henry nodded slowly, the full weight of his past choices crashing down around him. The meeting next week will happen exactly as scheduled, Tiffany finished. What happens after that depends on you. For once in your life, Henry, think about someone other than yourself. She stood, gathering her purse. You have until then to decide what kind of man you really are. With that, she left him sitting there, staring at the photo of the son he'd never known. The revelation hung in the cafe's air like smoke, making it hard for Henry to breathe. He hadn't moved from his seat since Tiffany left, the photograph of Jordan still on the table before him. The lunch crowd thinned, replaced by early dinner patrons, but he barely noticed. His phone buzzed repeatedly, messages from his office, other investors, meetings he was missing. None of it seemed important anymore. He picked up the photograph, studying his son's features. The proud smile at graduation. The determined look in his eyes. All the moments he'd missed, compressed into a single image. A shadow fell across the table. He looked up to find Jordan standing there, his expression hard, controlled. Tiffany stood a few steps behind him. She told me everything, Jordan said, his voice low and steady. 28 years of everything. Henry gestured to the empty chair, but Jordan remained standing. Power dynamics, Henry realized. Something he understood well. His son wouldn't cede even this small advantage. Jordan, Henry began, but Jordan cut him off. No. The word came sharp, precise. You don't get to start. I've spent my entire life with your silence. Now you're going to listen. The cafe had grown quieter, as if the space itself recognized the weight of this moment. Tiffany moved to a nearby table, close enough to intervene but giving them their space. Do you know what it's like? Jordan continued, each word measured, controlled. Growing up, every time I achieved something, there was this space. This empty chair where a father should have been. Science fairs, graduations, my first company launch. Mom was there. She was always there. But that space. That void you left. It never went away. Henry's hands tightened around his coffee cup. I made mistakes. I was young, focused on on success. Jordan's laugh was bitter. Yeah, I know all about your success, Henry. I studied you. Every company you built, every investment you made. I read every article, watched every interview. Trying to understand what was so important that you could walk away from your own child. Finally, Jordan sat down, leaning forward. But you know what I learned? What really stuck with me? How you built your empire by betting on people like you. Privileged. Connected. While overlooking innovators from communities like the one you left us in. Henry felt each word like a physical blow. Your company, was it just to get my attention? My company, Jordan's voice took on an edge of steel, is about making sure no other kid has to watch their single mother work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. It's about communities you've ignored, people you've written off. The fact that it got your attention. That's just karma's sense of humor. Tiffany watched from her table, tears threatening but held back by years of practice. She saw Henry's face as each of Jordan's words hit home, saw him finally facing the consequences of his choices. I want to make it right, Henry said quietly. the investment offer dash is business, Jordan cut in. And that's all it will ever be. You don't get to buy your way into being my father. That position has been filled by a woman who never walked away, who taught me that success means nothing if you forget where you came from. Henry stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. You think I don't regret it? That I don't look at my life, at everything I've built, and see what's missing? I see your mother in that competition room, and it's like 28 years never passed. I see you on that stage, and I see everything I could have been part of. Regret. Jordan stood too, his height matching his father's. Regret is what you feel when you make a mistake. Abandoning your pregnant wife, your unborn child. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. A choice you made every single day for 28 years. The cafe had gone completely silent now. Even the baristas had stopped their work, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. You want to invest in my company? Jordan continued, his voice dropping lower. Fine. Submit your proposal like any other investor. It'll be evaluated on merit alone. But don't expect it to buy you forgiveness. Don't expect it to erase what you did. Henry reached out, trying to touch his son's shoulder, but Jordan stepped back. Jordan, please. Let me try to dash. To what? Be a father now that I'm successful. Now that I fit into your world. Jordan shook his head. You don't get to choose when we become family. You made your choice a long time ago. Tiffany finally stood, moving to stand beside her son. The two of them together, a united front built over years of shared struggles and triumphs. Henry saw it then, the unbreakable bond between them, the strength they'd found in his absence. The meeting next week is cancelled, Jordan said firmly. If you want to invest, do it through proper channels. Otherwise, stay away from me and my mother. As Jordan turned to leave, Henry called out one last time. You're better than I ever was. You know that, right? Jordan paused, not turning around. Yeah, he said quietly. Mom made sure of that. They left Henry standing there, surrounded by the wreckage of choices made decades ago, finally understanding the true cost of his success. Tiffany's apartment felt smaller than usual that evening, filled with decades of unspoken words finally given voice. She stood in her kitchen, mechanically making tea, while Jordan sat at the small dining table where he'd done his homework all those years ago. The same table where she'd helped him with science projects, reviewed college applications, and celebrated his first business license. Baby, she said finally, placing a mug in front of him. Talk to me. Jordan stared into the steam rising from his cup. His professional demeanor had cracked, leaving behind the little boy who used to ask why his father never came to parent-teacher conferences. Did you ever imagine it happening like this? Meeting him. Tiffany pulled out the chair next to him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Honestly, I imagined it 1,000 different ways over the years. Every time you achieved something amazing, I thought about calling him, telling him what he'd missed. But I learned a long time ago that Henry's presence in our lives didn't define us. His absence made us stronger. I used to Google him, Jordan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Late at night, I'd read about his success, his investments. Sometimes I'd draft emails I never sent. Dear Dad, I made the honor roll. Dear Dad, I got into college. Dear Dad, I started my own company. He laughed, but the sound held no humor. Pathetic, right? No, baby. Tiffany wrapped her arm around his shoulders, feeling them shake slightly. It's human. You're allowed to feel everything you're feeling right now. The anger, the hurt, even the little boy who still wants his father's approval. None of that makes you weak. Meanwhile, across the city, Henry stood in his penthouse office, surrounded by the trappings of his success that suddenly felt meaningless. He'd pulled up every article about Jordan he could find, every piece of information about sustainable future tech. The more he read, the more he saw himself in his son's drive, his innovation, but tempered with something he'd lost along the way, purpose beyond profit. His phone rang, another investor interested in the competition. He ignored it. Instead, he walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The city lights blurred below, and for the first time in years, Henry Mitchell cried. Back in Tiffany's apartment, she and Jordan had moved to the living room couch, surrounded by old photo albums she'd pulled out. "Look at this one," she said, pointing to a picture of 10-year-old Jordan at his first science fair. "You were so proud of that solar-powered car model. You worked overtime for 3 weeks to buy the parts," Jordan remembered, touching the photograph gently. "The other kids had fancy store-bought projects, but you helped me build everything from scratch. And you won first place," Tiffany smiled. "Not because of expensive parts, but because you understood the science better than anyone. You wanted to make clean energy accessible to everyone, even back then." Jordan looked at his mother, really looked at her. The strength in her shoulders, the dignity in her bearing, the wisdom in her eyes. "How did you do it, Mom? Raise me alone, build your own success, never let the bitterness consume you." Tiffany was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "The day Henry left, I had 2 choices. I could let his absence define us, or I could use it as fuel to build something better. Every time life knocked us down, and baby, it knocked us down plenty, I looked at you and saw possibility. Not what we'd lost, but what we could build." "He wants to invest in the company," Jordan said, running his hands over his face. "Part of me wants to tell him to go to hell. But enough. Our part wants to prove to him what he missed." Tiffany finished. "Show him exactly what we built without him." "Is that petty?" "No, it's honest." She took his hand, the same hand she'd held through every childhood fever, every teenage heartbreak, every adult triumph. "But remember this, whatever you decide about the investment, decide it for your company, your vision, your future. Not for him." Jordan squeezed her hand, drawing strength from the connection that had never wavered. "When I saw him in that cafe, all I could think about was every time you came home exhausted from extra shifts, every time you sacrificed something for my dreams. How dare he show up now, thinking money can erase all that?" "Your anger is justified," Tiffany said softly. "But don't let it define your future the way I almost let it define our past. You've built something amazing, Jordan. Something that could help communities like ours. Don't let Henry's presence or absence affect that vision." They sat in comfortable silence, mother and son, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on love rather than abundance. Outside, the Brooklyn night hummed with life, with possibility, with the kind of resilience that had defined their journey. "Whatever you decide," Tiffany said finally, "know this, you never needed his validation. Every achievement, every breakthrough, every success. That's all you. And me." She smiled, touching his cheek. "I've been proud enough for 2 parents all along." Jordan leaned into his mother's touch, feeling the weight of the day's confrontation finally begin to lift. They'd faced everything else together. They'd face this too. The final round of the Tech Futures competition transformed the auditorium into an arena of tension. Jordan stood backstage, making last-minute adjustments to his presentation. The confrontation with Henry had changed something in him, stripped away the need for approval and replaced it with an even fiercer determination. Sarah approached, tablet in hand. "They're ready for us. But Jordan, there's something you should know. Henry Mitchell is still on the investor panel." Jordan nodded, straightening his tie. "Good. Let him watch." His voice carried a new confidence, one born not from defiance but from clarity. The presentation they'd prepared had evolved, incorporating elements of their conversation from the cafe. It wasn't just about technology anymore, it was about transformation. The main screen lit up as Jordan took the stage. The audience had grown since the preliminary round, filled with industry leaders, media, and potential investors. Henry sat in his usual central position, his expression carefully neutral, but his hands gripped his tablet with unusual force. "Last time I stood here," Jordan began, his voice steady, "I talked about technology. About innovation. Today, I want to talk about legacy." His eyes met Henry's briefly before scanning the room. "What do we leave behind? Who do we lift up as we climb?" The presentation unfolded like a story. Jordan showed maps of underserved communities, overlaid with energy consumption data. Each slide built upon the last, weaving technical brilliance with social impact. The prototype demonstration was flawless, but it was the vision that held the room spellbound. "We're not just selling solar storage," Jordan continued, his passion evident in every word. "We're selling possibility. The possibility that a single mother in Brooklyn can afford clean energy. That a community center in the Bronx can keep its lights on during blackouts. That a kid doing homework by candlelight might see a different future. In the audience, Tiffany sat straight-backed, watching her son command the stage that had once seemed to belong to men like Henry. She saw heads nodding, saw investors leaning forward in their seats. But most of all, she saw Henry's face as he realized exactly what his son had become without him. The questions began, technical and probing. Jordan handled each with expertise, but it was his response to the final question that shifted the energy in the room. "Your community-first model," a veteran investor asked, "it's admirable, but doesn't it limit your profit potential?" Jordan smiled, a smile that held echoes of his mother's strength. "Actually, it expands it. Traditional models ignore vast markets because they're deemed too risky or too poor. We're not just accessing these markets, we're transforming them. Every community we empower becomes a catalyst for growth. It's not charity, it's smart business." Henry shifted in his seat, his pen tapping against his notepad. The answer could have come from his own playbook, but with a conscience he'd forgotten somewhere along his climb to the top. He watched his son stand there, defending a vision that challenged everything the investment world took for granted, and felt an uncomfortable mix of pride and regret. "The numbers support this," Jordan continued, pulling up new projections. "Our pilot program in Brooklyn showed a 40% higher adoption rate than traditional models. Word-of-mouth marketing in close-knit communities reduced our customer acquisition costs by 60%. When you invest in community trust, the community invests back." The presentation concluded to substantial applause. As Jordan stepped down, Henry stood up, moving toward the stage. The room hushed, anticipating the confrontation between the competition's most prominent investor and its most compelling finalist. "Mr. Thompson," Henry's voice carried across the now quiet auditorium. "Your vision is challenging. It forces us to question our assumptions about profit and purpose." He paused, aware of all eyes on them. "As an investor, I have to ask, are you willing to compromise on the community aspect if the numbers demand it?" Jordan met his father's gaze steadily. "With respect, Mr. Mitchell, that's exactly the kind of thinking we're here to change. The community isn't an aspect of our business model, it is our business model. And our numbers prove it works." The tension between them crackled with unspoken words. In that moment, they weren't just founder and investor, or even father and son. They were two visions of success colliding, one built on individual achievement, the other on collective elevation. Tiffany watched from her seat, seeing the subtle shift in Henry's expression. For the first time, he wasn't looking at Jordan as a reminder of his past mistakes or a potential investment opportunity. He was seeing him as he was, a visionary who had turned his father's absence into a force for change. The judges huddled together, their whispered discussions carrying an urgency unusual for such events. Jordan's team waited offstage, their hopes riding on more than just potential funding. They'd become part of something bigger, a movement to prove that profit and purpose could coexist. As the judges prepared to announce their decision, 3 generations of choices hung in the balance: Henry's past abandonment, Tiffany's years of sacrifice, and Jordan's determination to build a different kind of legacy. The future waited to be written, but one thing was clear: whatever came next would be on Jordan's terms. Just as the head judge reached for the microphone to announce the competition results, a commotion erupted at the back of the auditorium. Marcus Chen, Henry's former partner from his early startup days, strode down the center aisle. His timing was deliberate, his expression grim. "Before you make that announcement," Marcus called out, his voice carrying through the room, "there's something everyone here should know about Henry Mitchell's investment practices." He held up a tablet, his finger hovering over the screen. "Particularly regarding minority-founded startups." Henry stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Marcus, this isn't the place dash." "When is the place, Henry?" Marcus turned to face the crowd. "For years, I watched you systematically undermine promising startups from minority founders. Not through outright rejection, that would be too obvious. No, you'd offer predatory investment terms, demand controlling interests, then strip the companies of their original vision." The room erupted in murmurs. Jordan stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Henry. "Is this true?" Marcus continued, pulling up documents on the main screen. "I have emails, meeting notes, internal memos. A pattern of targeting innovative companies from underserved communities, especially those focusing on social impact. Companies exactly like sustainable future tech. Tiffany rose from her seat, pieces of the past falling into place. That's why you were so interested in Jordan's community focus. You weren't planning to support it. You were planning to dismantle it. Henry moved to the center of the room, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. It wasn't like that. The market demands certain returns. The market. Jordan's voice cut through the chaos. Or your prejudices. He walked toward his father, each step heavy with realization. How many dreams did you crush? How many innovators did you silence because they didn't fit your narrow vision of success? The judges whispered among themselves, clearly disturbed by the revelations. The head judge leaned into her microphone. In light of these allegations, Mr. Mitchell is recused from the final decision. But Jordan raised his hand. No. Let him stay. He turned to face the crowd. Because this is bigger than one competition. This is about systemic barriers that have held back countless innovators. About powerful men who claim to reward merit while stacking the deck against those who look like me. Henry stood alone in the center of the room, facing his son. For the first time, his polished exterior cracked completely. Jordan, I didn't know you were my son when I first reviewed your proposal. But you're right. About all of it. I became exactly what I fought against when I started. I forgot where I came from. Where you came from. Tiffany stepped forward. You came from privilege, Henry. You never had to fight for respect, for opportunity. You never had to prove yourself worthy of basic consideration. Jordan held up his hand, silencing the room. But that changes today. Not just for me, but for every entrepreneur who's been shut out, undervalued, or exploited. He turned to the judges. I withdraw from the competition. Gasps filled the auditorium. Sarah started to protest, but Jordan continued. Instead, I propose something different. Mr. Mitchell, you want to make amends. Use your influence to create a fund specifically for minority founders. Not controlled by you, but by leaders from our communities. Transform your guilt into actual change. Henry stood silent for a long moment, then slowly nodded. You're right. About everything. He turned to face the crowd. I'll commit $50 million to start. With no controlling interest. No predatory terms. A true investment in change. And sustainable future tech. Jordan asked, his voice carrying a challenge. Will remain entirely under your control, Henry replied. With standard investment terms, if you'll still consider them. Not as your father, but as someone who finally sees the value of your vision. Tiffany moved to stand beside her son, her hand finding his shoulder. The choice is yours, baby. But remember what I said about letting him define your future. Jordan looked between his parents, the mother who'd never left, the father who'd never stayed, and made his decision. I'll consider your investment, Mr. Mitchell. But first, you'll need to face every founder you've wronged. Make it right with them. Show me that you understand what real change requires. The room had grown quiet, witnessing not just the resolution of a competition, but the transformation of an industry's dark history into a potential force for good. I understand, Henry said softly. Then, louder, I understand completely. As the crowd began to disperse, Jordan, Tiffany, and Henry stood in their triangle of shared history and possible future. None of them were the same people who'd entered that auditorium. Their wounds weren't healed, but perhaps they'd found something more valuable than closure, purpose. Jordan looked at his team, at his mother, at the father he'd never known, and smiled slightly. Now, he said, the real work begins. And in that moment, 3 generations of pain began its slow transformation into possibility.